So people can be very weird. We can even affect people that we never even notice. It just blows my mind, some of the thoughts that run through other people's minds. And I'll tell you my story and you'll know what I mean. And at the time, I was working a ton. I was saving money to buy my girlfriend a ring. And spoiler alert, we're married now. We were renting a small house, but still better than the apartment because at least we weren't sharing walls. I was also saving money so we could buy a house. She was also saving money for the same reason. Since I was working so much, she decided to volunteer for a 5-day retreat with the company she worked for. She would get paid a ton of overtime, and this allowed me to work overtime at my job, even more than I already was doing. I was going to miss her, but it seemed like a great opportunity to bring home some extra cash, especially with the holidays rapidly approaching at the time. On Wednesday, when I left for work, I noticed a weird smell in my car. Not a bad smell, just a very strange one. It was sort of like a perfume, but one that a younger girl would wear. Some thoughts crossed my mind, but I eventually just threw it up to some weirdness I didn't understand, and honestly, I didn't care much either. It was just small after all. And that night, I had a horrible time sleeping. I told myself it was most likely because I missed my girlfriend. I was always used to her being there, and now this was the 3rd night in a row that I was sleeping alone. I swore that I could hear noises all night long coming from downstairs, but it wasn't loud enough or scary enough to sort of raise any alarm bells, so again, I ignored the weird signs and told myself that it was probably just house noises or the wind. Thursday morning arrived and I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I made my coffee and hoped that it would do the trick soon. When I got to the car, I found it unlocked. I'm good about locking the car door, but I've been working a lot and the thought of forgetting to lock the door was on my mind. Ignoring the unlocked door, I got into the car and started to drive to work. Now, same story as the previous day, I could smell that perfume again. And now some red flags were raising, but I couldn't even begin to think about what could possibly be going on. Every thought I had ended with me blaming it on myself for being overtired or missing my girlfriend. It was the most logical explanation, at least to me at the time. I left work that evening, and once again the smell in my car was clearly perfume. I even had a coworker come over and smell my car just to make sure that I wasn't being delusional. He said that he could clearly smell it too. It was probably just my girlfriend's perfume, and because I missed her, I'm starting to subconsciously notice certain smells that I may have gone nose-blind to. I knew the smell of her perfume, and I knew that it wasn't it. But what he said seemed kind of logical, and that I just assumed he was correct. Maybe my senses of smell were changing. And when I got home, again, all I could smell was that perfume, and now I was really weirded out. I kept trying to convince myself that my coworker was correct, but it wasn't working. I decided to take a shower and go grab some food and a drink at the bar just to sort of unwind. My girlfriend was coming home the next afternoon, and it was also my first day off in 13 days, so I was ready to relax. I got home late that Thursday night, and maybe at around midnight, and got myself ready for bed. That smell hit me as soon as I opened the door to the house. I was more annoyed at this point than anything else. I was never scared, it was just so weird that it bothered me. I got into bed not long after getting home and started to fall asleep. I knew that she was coming home tomorrow, so I was hoping all the weird smells would go away. I must have fallen asleep for a little while because I was awoken by someone getting into the other side of the bed. For a second, I thought it was my girlfriend. I was half asleep and my mind just went right to her. As she was getting into bed, she shushed me, and I turned back around. She started to cuddle up to me like she was the big spoon, which she had never done before, but I was so tired and so happy that she was home that I didn't even care. Maybe a minute later, my eyes shot open. I looked down, and a woman's forearm was lying across my body, holding me. I smelled the arm, and I instantly recognized the perfume. This was not my girlfriend. Then I started to come to my senses, and I remembered that she wasn't coming home until the afternoon. Why would she have come home in the middle of the night? I jumped out of bed, freaking out. I turned the lights on, and just sitting in my bed was some young girl, probably in her mid-20s. She was smiling, and kept brushing her hair away from her face. She kept asking me what was wrong and calling me babe. I was screaming for her to get out of my bed, but she just kept smiling. I called the police, but she didn't even react. She started to shush me again, and she kept trying to rub my arm. The entire time I was freaking out and telling her that the cops were coming, but she didn't seem to care. She didn't look crazy or anything. She looked like a pretty normal girl. She was also dressed in a very small and low-cut piece of nightwear, and when she got out of bed to try and console me, she put on a low-cut fluffy robe. The cops showed up, and I immediately went to them pleading my case, and the woman just sat there, letting me do this. She wasn't armed, she hadn't tried to hurt me, and there had been no issues with the law prior or anything I later heard. She was just some girl. The cops take her out, and she says in some weird calm voice to me that she loves me, saying that she'll be back and that this is just a misunderstanding. My heart is going 100 beats a second, but after some investigating, it turns out this woman was our neighbor on the street we lived on. She was a quiet girl, so quiet that I didn't even know that she existed on the same street. And while she lived at this house, she developed some obsession, sort of an infatuation with me. When she noticed my girlfriend hadn't been around for a few days, she started to break in, and the poor girl convinced herself that I was in love with her. Through all of this, she was never dangerous, and thankfully that was the case because who knows what would have happened if she actually meant me harm. But even though the woman meant no harm, it doesn't make the situation any less creepy. I had a borderline stalker living in my house for almost a week, and she got into my bed with me. She never returned to her house, and we moved shortly after that anyway. From what I understand, she had family, and the family was notified, and last I knew, she was being treated for some type of illness. I'm not sure what it was, so forgive my ignorance, but now do you know what I mean when I say people are weird? You just truly never know what could happen.
Hey everyone, we truly appreciate your support. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel for more upcoming stories and exciting content.
I think the word toxic is actually toxic, and we throw the word around like it's some sort of frisbee. One topic that has always got brought up in that toxic conversation is toxic exes. Oh, how exes are terrible. Not all exes are bad though, but the ones that are, I think truly encompasses the word toxic. You see, I was engaged a few years ago and it ended very poorly. My fiancée got a job about 100 miles from our hometown, so I moved with her and started a life here. I didn't have friends or family or anyone to turn to when we broke up, and because of the job I started, I decided not to head home just yet. It's not important how things ended, but they did end very poorly. She begged for me back, but I couldn't put myself through that heartache again. Right after the breakup, she kept the house, and I found a small one-bedroom apartment. I just hoped that I would be able to meet some new friends, which I am really bad at, by the way. A few weeks after the breakup, I was just sitting in the apartment sulking, which was my favorite hobby around that time. The apartment was on the first floor of the building, which was really like the half-basement, if that makes sense. My windows were at eye level, and it was just my head that was above ground. The rest of the apartment was below the ground. I had a lovely view of nothing to help me cope with my crippling depression at the time. One night, while I was just sort of being a bum, the power went out. We were having a pretty bad storm, and the last time we had a storm like this, the power was out for several hours. I knew I couldn't just sit in silence, and since it was getting late, I couldn't really go anywhere anyway, even though I probably wouldn't have if I could. I lit a few candles that I had and sat at my table. It was a small table that only fit 2 chairs. I loved to draw and color in high school, and I had some talent before I gave it up. This was the perfect chance for me to draw and just sort of get lost in something that I used to love so much. While I was drawing, trying to get my mind off of my ex, I heard something. It was a loud noise, and it sounded pretty close. Unfortunately, it was too dark to see anywhere in my apartment other than the little area that I was sitting in with the candles. I slowly walked over to where I heard the noise, and lying at my window outside was what looked like some sort of figure. I jumped back because I was scared, even though I knew this had to be crazy. No one would break into this apartment. They would have to get on their stomach and practically crawl into the apartment, not to mention hardly anyone in this town knows even who I am. I went back to the small table and blew the candles out. This way I could use the darkness to my advantage and be able to see out the window better. I didn't know for sure what I saw at this point, and it's possible that it could have been nothing. It could have even been a skunk or something trying to get out of the storm. I just didn't know. I went back over to the window and I could see it clearly now. This was no animal, and this was not my imagination. Lying on the ground trying to open the window was a person dressed in all dark clothes. I freaked out. I didn't know what to do. The obvious answer was to call the police or the authorities or whoever, but I don't know why in the heat of the moment that just didn't cross my mind. The only person I really knew was my ex-fiancée, and I decided to give in to my fear and loneliness and call her for help. And right as I pressed call, a light could be seen shining through the window, and a brief melody of a ringtone could be heard. The call went right to voicemail after that, I guess, and knowing what was most likely happening, I decided to call right back to see if it was a coincidence. And sure enough, the light and ringtone went off for a split second before the intruder shut it off. My ex was trying to break into my apartment. But why? At this hour, in this weather, her intentions were clearly sinister. I started to yell and she kept trying to break in through the window, but thankfully it remained locked. I called the police, and as soon as she heard me on the phone, I saw her get up and run off. I told the cops everything when they arrived. They actually didn't believe me right away, and they looked almost annoyed, like I was bothering them with this. But when they looked out the window, they could see the spot in the dirt where someone was lying, and there were clearly signs of forced entry. They finally agreed to follow up and see where my ex was. When the cops went and questioned her, she seemed to deny everything, which didn't surprise me. She said that she had been with her new boyfriend and that I needed to move on. This guy also vouched for her and said that she was at the house the entire night with him. Either this guy was in on it, or she was already manipulating him. I called her out for being a liar, and I was the one who was branded a liar and a crazy ex at the end of it. When I brought up that I called her twice and both times the phone lit up, she said that her phone was broken, so it couldn't have been her. And this was it for me. I couldn't live in this town anymore, and now that I didn't feel safe being here either, I paid an early termination fee for my lease and I moved home to stay with my family until I got back on my feet. I've never heard from her again, and I'm so thankful for that. My life is much better without that toxic human ruining my life. Let me first say that this story is a little depressing, and it makes me feel sad writing it, but it doesn't change the fact that this was one of the most frightening nights of my entire life. My father passed away when I was 4 or 5 years old. My mom met David when I was 10 years old, and he ended up adopting me several years later. Even though David wasn't my real father, he raised me as if though I was his own daughter, and I loved him like he was my real dad. Scratch that. I hate the phrase, real dad. That man wasn't like a real father. He was my father. He was a great man, and he treated my mother and me like we were the most important things in the world. A few months back, David passed away. He got sick suddenly, and he died not long after. It was sad, and it hit my mom really hard. He was old, but it didn't hurt any less. My elderly mother was already declining in her health, and we were worried that this may be the final straw that broke her back. A few nights after the funeral, Mom would call me in the middle of the night. Every time I thought, oh no, and figured the worst. It was bad, but not the type of bad that I thought. She was terrified. 2 nights in a row, she called and claimed that someone was in her house. She could hear them moving around, and she was incredibly scared. My husband and I felt horrible. On both days, we went over and searched the entire house and found nothing out of place. It didn't look like anybody broke in. Nothing was stolen, and we triple-checked that everything was locked up tight. On the third day, my mom begged me to stay overnight. This was if the intruder showed up again. I could witness and either stop them or call the police or something. Honestly, I just thought my mom was really tired and was dreaming and thinking her dreams were real or something. And at some point during the night, I thought that I heard someone or something coming from the dining room. It was jarring because it was clearly a voice. For a single second, I thought my mom was right and people were breaking into the home. I slowly got off the couch and started to head toward the noise. I rolled out ghosts because I'm not really into any of that, and I started to think that maybe it was someone homeless or something and they were squatting inside this elderly person's home. All these ideas were running through my head 1,000,000 miles per hour as I was drawing closer to the noise. When I was only one room away, I could clearly hear the voice. It was my mom. I stopped sneaking at that point and walked into the dining room. My mom was sitting at the head of the table and having a full-blown conversation with nobody. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. Her eyes were wide open, but they were almost glazed over. She was awake and asleep, and she never looked in my direction, but she knew that I walked in. In a cheerful voice, she said,
"Hello, dear. I'm just enjoying some time with David."
I looked over, and the chair next to her was slightly pulled out like my mom pulled it out for someone to sit in. I got closer to my mom, and her eyes were even more disturbing. It was like I could only see the white parts of her eyes, and mix that with her smiling and talking, and it was incredibly creepy. I tried to gently tell my mother that David passed away, and she just laughed and waved her hand in my face and said,
"You're so silly. David's sitting right here."
I was at a loss for words. I didn't know the correct way to handle this. Do I just make my grieving and elderly mother happy and let her think that she's talking to her dead husband? Or do I try and wrangle her way back to reality and her crushing heartbreak? She grabbed my hand and, still not looking in my direction or changing her facial features, she says to me,
"You can leave now, sweetie. I don't know why I was so scared. It was just David cleaning the house that I heard last night. It was just David. It was just David."
I remember it word for word. She kept repeating that last part. The sleep talking turned into gibberish, and then every once in a while I would hear the name David slip out of her mouth. I didn't realize until that night just how hard my mother took the loss and how fragile her mind had become. When I tried to move my mother, she snapped and growled at me like she was some animal saying, "Don't touch me, I'm talking to him." I called my husband and he met me over there, and we decided to call 911 because we didn't know what else to do. When they tried to take her to the hospital, she became extremely hostile and even violent, not because we were taking her from her home, but because we were taking her from David. She kept saying that she wasn't allowed to leave because David wanted her there. The mind can truly conjure up anything when it's hurting, and my mother passed away not long after that night, God rest her soul. She never came back to herself after that night either. Her half-opened eyes and sleepwalking appearance never went back to normal. The doctors told me that she had some type of nervous breakdown, and due to her age, she couldn't separate reality from her mind. It really is so sad. When my biological father passed away, my mom was a wreck, but buried those emotions to raise me. David saved her in so many ways, so when she lost him, it was like she lost nearly everything. I'm sorry if the story was a downer, but I'll never forget how my mother was acting that night. I'm a skeptical person, but a part of me almost believes that David was there with her. It's creepy, but the mind is an insane tool. Even just my mom thinking that the man was sitting with her freaks me out a little bit. And take care of yourself, folks, and tell your loved ones that you love them any chance you get.